we're ready to go. My name is Rosanna Iacono. I'm the co-founder of a strategy consultancy called The Growth Activists, and I'm going to be your moderator today. I'd like to start by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, on whose lands we meet today, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and future. Today's talk is part of the AFC's Responsible Fashion series presented by the City of Sydney, and we'd like to thank the IMG and Afterpay Australian Fashion Week for hosting the talk today. Let's get into it and let me introduce our illustrious panel today, a wonderful panel of experts. We'll be talking about the topic of fashion as a force for change and really as a force for good. So first off, we have Grace Lillian-Lee, founder of First Nations Fashion and Design. We have Grace Forrest, founding director of Walk Free. Mary Lou Ryan, Director of Sustainability and Supply Chain and co-founder of bassike. And Leila, Naja, Hibri, the CEO of the Australian Fashion Council. To say that there is major change happening at the moment in terms of responsible business in the fashion industry would be a massive understatement. Particularly in the last 12 to 18 months, we've just seen so much change take place. Certainly from a sustainability standpoint, the standards that were okay a couple of years ago just don't cut it anymore. The topic has really broadened and encompasses so much more than it used to, and that's from an environmental sustainability standpoint. We also saw last year with the death of George Floyd and the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, an explosion of social justice on the world stage. And the fashion industry very quickly got drawn into it. We had social media watchdogs like Diet Prada calling out the racism that had been rife in the fashion industry for decades. And they're continuing to call out behaviours like greenwashing and whitewashing and any other number of unpalatable practices that Gen Z and millennials in particular, who are the most principled generations, just won't stand for anymore. So huge change there. And we've also seen change in the last 12 months and headlines, new headlines in relation to workers across the supply chain, particularly when a whole group of retailers, including some high-profile Australian retailers, cancelled their orders with Bangladeshi manufacturers, often orders that had already been made and were boxed and were ready to ship, creating devastating effects on those businesses, but also on their workers. So there's no doubt that COVID has been the great accelerator. It definitely has. It has accelerated a number of different topics. It's helped us see that it's not just sustainability, which has been the topic, but there are a whole range of other issues that are at stake. We're moving away from shareholder primacy to a more stakeholder capitalist model where businesses, particularly in some more progressive areas like tech, they're thinking about a bigger group of stakeholders. Yes, shareholders, but also employees and workers through the supply chain, the environment, the community, and customers. So that's what we're here to talk about today. We're at a turning point in the fashion industry where we can go back and remake it better. It's time to build back better, and what we're going to be talking with these leaders about is how they are building back better in their own different areas. So I'm really excited to explore this topic together with our amazing panel. So the first area that I really want to touch on is modern slavery. And I think it's one of those areas that doesn't get the headlines it deserves. It really does deserve a whole lot more headlines. And I was pretty horrified just researching the topic when I looked at the stats and the data, the fact that fashion is the second biggest contributor to modern slavery after electronics. 40 million people are affected, and 71% of them are women and girls. So I guess my first question is for you, Grace. What does modern slavery actually entail? What are some of the risks that vulnerable workers are facing? And then why did you start Walk Free?
Thank you, Rosanna. Well, modern slavery is the systematic removal of a person's freedom, where one person is exploited by another for personal or financial gain. It's actually an umbrella term used to describe a number of highly exploitative practices, including forced labour, forced marriage, human trafficking, debt bondage, and state-imposed forced labour. The two that we see are most prevalent for the fashion industry are forced labour and state-imposed forced labour. But we know through our most recent research, Stacked Odds, that modern slavery vulnerability is compounded by each other. So actually one form of modern slavery can make you more vulnerable to others, which is why it's such a problem for gender equality. As you said, 71% of all victims globally are women and girls. But to put that figure into kind of more reasonable numbers, we're talking about 1 in every 130 women and girls on Earth living in modern slavery. There are more than 130 people in this room right now. And the reality is that we're also connected to these women living in modern slavery through the clothes on our back. You might be thinking, it's not in the particular item of clothing I'm wearing, but are you sure? Do you know who made that item of clothing? Do you know who assembled the fabric? Do you know who picked the cotton? Fashion is particularly vulnerable to modern slavery because they're transnational, multinational supply chains. And what we've seen in situations of crisis and vulnerability, say in regards to the COVID-19 pandemic, is that the world's most vulnerable people have been hit hardest and first the entire time. And it's been done at the hands of businesses over and over. So while there have been some watchdogs calling that out and the pay up movement has been informative for this, it's not been nearly enough. And I think that we need to move this conversation so that those at the front of supply chains who are struggling to just put food on the tables for their families, who are likely young women of colour making our clothes, aren't hit first, rather than the wealthy execs at the top, protected by large health systems and safe, stable countries. It's not feminism if it exploits another woman first.
Absolutely. And one thing that's really interesting, I find very interesting, 2 years ago, or I think it was 3 years ago now, the Modern Slavery Act was passed in Australia, which requires businesses with over 100 million turnover to very rigorously report on their analysis of modern slavery through their supply chain. What about all the other businesses that are turning over under 100 million, which is,
most
the majority of the fashion, absolutely, most businesses, not ASX 200, and particularly fashion businesses. What does that mean for them? What should they be thinking about?
Well, I think the Modern Slavery Act has been a really important first step for our country in drawing a line in the sand, in saying that when we talk about brand Australia, it can't be values here at the exploitation of values elsewhere. And, we have problems absolutely on our shores here at home as well in regards to this exploitation. What we want the Modern Slavery Act to now set as a foundation is that the threshold will be lowered and that transparency still transcends and trickles down into other labels. The reality is that while the Act only requires businesses over 100 million to report on acts of modern slavery, this legislation needs to go beyond transparency and into remediation. And when that threshold drops, which it inevitably will, and when consumers continue to become awakened and aware of these problems, businesses have a very short time period to get on the front of this and to be the hero of their own story. The greatest perpetrators of this problem need to become the people that actually remediate the issues that they are creating. And with the consumer power angle, I think that while what each of us do absolutely matters, the accountability that we hold people to online, the way that we spend our money, that matters. But it is not the consumer's responsibility for the mass exploitation is to get it by business. So we need businesses to individually sign up and do this. And there are a number of examples of that, of fashion brands here this week. But there are also a number of major fashion brands here this week that have zero information about where their garments come from, zero information about the conditions in which they were made. And the reality is, and this is a bit of a controversial statement, but if there's zero information, I would strongly encourage you to assume the worst. Because if a brand is doing something right, they'll probably claim it. People like marketing. People like to be clapped along. So no one's doing secret good work protecting their workers. I don't personally believe that exists. And without transparency, we cannot see or protect vulnerability. It's the bedrock on which accountability can be built and remediation must then be instilled.
Yeah, that expectation around transparency is absolutely a major theme, and I think is really being driven absolutely by consumers. But yeah, you're right, businesses do need to get on the front foot. What about really small businesses? What tools can they access to start to get a little bit of a grip on the topic and start to explore how they can start to make some change?
Well, I guess it starts from relationships. You know, when you start a business, of course, you have to work with a number of suppliers and other people. No one is doing this by themselves. Many brands here are producing things in the same factories. And I think it's about having honest conversations about the roadblocks that are really there for small and large businesses, and understanding the vulnerability on a regional and national level in countries where you're operating or where you're procuring your goods from. And again, it does come back to transparency. If you don't have that visibility, it's not that hard to find it, and it shouldn't be so hard for consumers to find that information. So I think it's about starting from a place of transparency, and that can help with tools like Good On You that feed off a transparency model. Equally, for Walk Free, we have 68 free publications on our website. We have a business toolkit. We produce the Global Slavery Index, which is the world's leading data set on measuring and understanding modern slavery. We've worked very hard to make that a free resource. That's what is underpinning the Modern Slavery Act. It's what's underpinning the ESG models for businesses, and that's free to everyone.
Yeah.
It is a very large
Love
document,
that.
so I'm not expecting everyone to read that.
No.
Measuring slavery across 168 countries, but the resources are definitely there, and I think it's about it. Transparency shouldn't be a choice, it should be the norm.
No, and I love that you've open sourced those tools and you've put them out there for the industry to begin to learn and adopt. Yeah, that's brilliant. It's a really good segue over to sustainability, and I want to ask you, Mary Lou, about your journey with bassike. I mean, when you and Deb founded the business, you really instilled sustainability principles into it from the outset. But sustainability has changed tremendously over the last few years. That bar has been raised. The standards are so much higher than they used to be. How has it impacted the way you go about doing business? Because what I'm hearing is, even from Grace, is businesses need to embed some of these ways of working into their operating models. So how has taking on some of these sustainability commitments changed the bassike business?
Yeah, well, in 2006 when we started the brand, we started with sustainability and organic cotton, and we also started with producing locally in Australia. So at the moment we produce about 95% of our production onshore here, and that was really about supporting local industry and transparency and building partnerships and relationships. So I guess that really built a really strong foundation for how we actually have always conducted business. So it was always about partnerships, longevity. It was about making the right choices about who we wanted to partner with, from whether it was a raw material supplier right through our garment manufacturing. And because we produce here too, that really allows us to kind of really understand that. 12 months ago, we sort of went through the whole COVID period, and that sort of really gave us a good opportunity, because both Deb and I worked in sort of creative and both looked after collections. But we really wanted to, again, sort of take the time to really sort of pull our business apart. And so I kind of spent the last 12 months really just focusing on transparency of supply chain, and have sort of built some internal metrics and some modelling around everything from raw material supply right through to who we produce with. And we sort of identified who our long-term partners were, what we needed to replace in our business, and certainly things that we wanted to exit, because we felt that that was the right decision for us to, if that was what we wanted to stand for as a sustainable brand and an ethical manufacturer, then we really needed to sort of forge that path. So that was a really fascinating time for us. I mean, the good thing for me was that when you do pull your business apart, I was really proud to look at what we had done and going, not even, that was a very unconscious but conscious, decision that we made. And when we did pull it apart, it was like, we've done some really great work here for 15 years. No one really kind of, at the time, it's taken us a long time to get that messaging out as well, because it wasn't really something that people really cared about, even at a consumer level. But now, sort of, 12 months on, and it's probably one of the topics that people are talking about the most. We see people coming into our stores and asking where are the garments being made, and where's the fabric from, and Before people didn't really care about that, but I think there's definitely far more sort of conscious thinking around where garments are being made at the moment, and it's nice that we can actually really honestly and authentically talk to that.
That's brilliant, yeah. And I think there is still that perception that it's something that's a little bit on the fringe, but you're seeing it actually in quite a mainstream way with consumers. So that's brilliant. I think that's a really, really strong signal.
Yeah.
And what about for businesses who are at the beginning of their sustainability journey, and you have embedded it from the outset, but they may be at the very start, they might be feeling very overwhelmed by it. What's your advice to them?
I think one of the most important things is to really, understand the value of true cost and what it actually costs to produce, a white T-shirt. Because if it doesn't, and because there is a lot of pressure at price point level when you do build a brand. So I think getting your strategy and your positioning around price point is really critical, so you can actually produce the product to how much it actually costs. And then I think, there's so many wonderful, information out there, whether it's around sustainability, verification, certification. I think people have to, they can't just say what they're doing. They really need to start to verify that what they're saying is true.
Yes.
And so that's, I would say to anyone that is starting, to really kind of pull that apart and really understand that. And it's not just about fabric price. It could be about what the true cost of, whether it's freight and your carbon footprint, and there's so many elements that actually build into what the true cost of a product is. To understand that.
Great. And then one more question. I mean, we talked about how sustainability is really expanding. It's, there are so many more topics that fall under the umbrella of sustainability. What are you seeing as some of the newer emerging topics that need to be thought about?
Look, I think it's actually I'm kind of energised, I think, by sort of what's happening at the moment, because I think, when things, when you are challenged around your decision making, it does force creativity and innovation. So I do think as an industry, the way that we've been doing it for such a long time, it just does not work. And so we really need to be investing in innovation and technology and finding new and better ways that we can actually sustain the fashion industry and continue to make product, because I love fashion, I love product, I love wearing clothes, and I want to feel good about that.
Yeah, no, love that. And Leila, last week you were at Minister Susan Ley, the Federal Minister for the Environment, at her roundtable, which was all about discussing sustainability and circularity. What were some of the big topics that were raised, particularly pertaining to the fashion industry?
Sure. So the roundtable was around textile waste, and we had some great representatives and stakeholders from the fashion industry, academics and other experts, and also government officials. And the main topics, of course, of discussion was, what do we do with all the textile waste? I'll give you a couple of stats. 27 kilograms per person purchased in Australia in clothing every year. 27 kilograms we eat, on average, right? That's a lot. 23 kilograms of which ends up in landfill. 800,000 tons of textile waste a year. So we are, I think, the second largest consumers of textile in the world, and of course I'm talking about apparel and clothing. So huge problem. Surprisingly, in Australia, we still haven't dealt with it at all. But the great thing is now Susan Lee's put textile as a priority on her waste list. And so, someone said to me, "Oh, that means you're in the bad books." I'm like, "Yeah, but we were already in the bad books. It's just time to do something about it." And she's also allocated $1 million seeding fund for a product stewardship scheme around textile waste in clothing and apparel in Australia, which is great. This will help our industry work towards a plan of how do we deal with textile waste, and hopefully a plan towards a circular economy, because that's really the North Star, the end goal for our industry.
Yeah, and so that also may require Department of Industry to invest in the technology and the innovation up front to actually reinvent materials from the outset that can be truly circular.
Absolutely.
And yeah.
Yeah, I think that's the only way for us to go forward, really, if we want to. But more importantly, going back to the drawing board, to the designers, to the sourcing. So if we design in a circular fashion, and you know, Grace and I have talked about this before, the indigenous people, but First Nations people have, for tens of thousands of years, been actually producing clothing and designing clothing in a circular way. So we have our First Nations people there available to help us and to go back to our original way of doing things. So I think, yeah, it's a great moment for the industry to relook at how we do things.
Yeah, okay, fantastic. And whilst I have you, I want to talk about gender equality. And this week on Monday, congratulations, by the way, on publishing a landmark economic study on the fashion industry. And one of the statistics that was very interesting was that 77% of the of workers in the fashion industry are women. Yeah. What are some of the hidden issues behind that statistic?
Look, a few things, including, let's start from maybe bottom up, if you like, wages for women in our industry, career opportunities and career pathways. How can you actually, on I don't know, an average of $50,000 a year, raise a family in the long term, and grow and aspire to a great career. So this is one of the areas that is an issue. Also, really representation at C-level and board level. We are in an industry where no one can use merit as a reason and representation, again, as a reason of why women aren't in leadership positions. Yet, when you look at some of the stats, this is, I think, from, sorry, I had the name here, but Gender Equality sort of Association in Australia. And even though in the clothing retail part of the industry, about 85% of the workers are women, only 25% of CEOs are women. I think boards are in a way worse shape than even leadership. So it starts really from leadership. If we want to be a nation that has gender equality, why don't we have women as many women in leadership as the percentage of women working in the industry?
Yeah, absolutely. No, absolutely. And what about for smaller businesses, small and medium-sized businesses? What are some of the things in Australia, what are some of the things they should be thinking about right now in order to drive greater gender equality?
That's really interesting. I think in smaller businesses, women are actually in leadership positions, and in particular, if there's it's not like obviously like a large ASX company, but I think we need to start to look at things like career progression, again, career pathways, education, training. Are we giving women the opportunity, and do we tell them what are the different professions that can be actually had in our industry? It's not only be a fantastic creative designer. I mean, not everyone can be a designer. We're very lucky to have a couple here on the panel, but there's some great jobs that are all technical jobs, as you know, pattern making, machinists, cutters. We still need a lot of people in those jobs. There's also a lot of now new jobs like digital marketing, also really merchandising. We need to become really stronger in these areas in order to become more efficient in business. And of course, STEM, like there's science, industrial engineering, all sorts of areas that we can look at to direct women and give them an opportunity to grow and have a very clear way that they can progress and create a great life for themselves and their families.
Yeah, absolutely. And we know that when women are economically empowered, they create incredible effects for their families and their entire communities. So, no, brilliant. And Grace, this morning, The Australian published an article, an opinion piece that you wrote, where you actually linked feminism to modern slavery. Can you just expand a little bit more on your view on how the two are intertwined?
Yeah, well, essentially the idea is that unless our feminism includes the women who make our clothes, it's not feminism. You can't, as has been famously said, you can't harm women in one country to empower them in another. That's some bullshit. And, when International Women's Day comes around and we see shirts that say girls can, made in Bangladesh by girls who absolutely cannot, that's just a scary Hunger Games style reality that we're all feeding into. Last year, I really started thinking about modern intersectional feminism a lot more after that fast fashion company Boohoo was found having workers working in the UK. So again, don't be fooled by made in Australia, made in the UK necessarily meaning things made 100% fairly. Workers in the UK being forced to work through lockdown, being locked in the factories they were working at night, being paid half the minimum wage with no PPE. The only reason this factory got found out is because they all got sick. And they were like, oh my gosh, where did this COVID come from? Well, it came from this hideous exploitation created by a fast fashion company. But most ironically, they were making shirts that said pandemic pals and stick together, while exploiting people in the worst regard on their soil in the UK. So I think that, as I said, unless our feminism includes the women and people who make our clothes, it's not real. It doesn't stick. And I think the same goes for sustainability. Unless our sustainability includes the women who makes our clothes, it's not sustainability either. You can't harm people to protect the planet. It's a complete oxymoron. Any company that's willing to harm or not protect another human being for their most basic human rights and dignity will never protect the planet. So that's a quick way to look for greenwashing if there's no information about workers.
No, absolutely. No, thank you for sharing that perspective. And I want to move on to the topic of racial discrimination and racial inclusivity and what needs to be done. And I think before I touched on what happened in the US last year, and in Australia as well, the Black Lives Matter, spelt differently, BLAK, exploded onto the Australian stage as well. And I think there's a much greater awareness in places like the US. We have seen a lot more fashion businesses committing to anti-racism training throughout their organisations. But we've also seen things like the 15% pledge, where both in the UK and the US, some multi-brand retailers and department stores have committed to stocking 15% of their inventory being from Black-owned businesses. So we've seen some really amazing things happen, but what's happened in Australia really tangibly? And I guess this question is for you, Grace. What has happened? Has enough happened since this racial inequality issue came to light? And if not, what needs to happen?
Thank you for having me here today to be a part of this conversation. I feel really honoured to be here on Gadigal country. Please excuse me, I've only had less than 2 hours of sleep leading up to our first All First Nations runway.
Which, by the way, congratulations.
Yes. Thank you. It's really quite triggering, actually, even just sitting here and listening to the conversations, to be honest. It's hard to hear, not just for the lack of sleep, but also just there's so much change that needs to happen within the industry. I think when it comes to, First Nations Fashion and Design's been founded by the industry, and I have Tegan Calishaw sitting in the crowd, who's also been working with me on this movement, which has been a long time in the making. And we see it as a really important movement and platform to create some true change within our nation. I guess there's so much going on globally, and sitting here I can feel that impact, and we know that, but we're really quite insular in what's happening here on our country and trying to create small steps of change. I think that in terms of last year,
and sorry, it makes me emotional talking about it because it was a flood. It was, and it was a lot. A lot of people were knocking at our doors, coming, and we felt like a trend. And we have a panel discussion tomorrow called Not Just Trending for that whole purpose. And yeah, I think that, there just needs to be more discussion and safe places around this space of evolving and growing a more inclusive space. And I think that there's an opportunity for us to create economic growth for our First People within our country and to be producing locally and not moving so fast. I think that, I'm a weaver, so I sit and I weave every piece of mine. And this is a technique taught to me by one of my elders. And I feel really privileged and honoured to be able to share that with the fashion industry. And I feel like anyone that purchases a piece is like they get an insight into my life and my journey, but also they get to celebrate our First People and be proud of that. And I think that that's really important for change for our nation.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. And one thing that I noticed is that you've created an FNFD directory, which enables other fashion businesses to actually tap into the incredible talent, Indigenous creatives. What advice you hear lots of brands saying, oh, we've got to do something, and we've got to, how can they engage in a truly authentic and respectful way with First Nations people? What's your advice for businesses that are saying, we want to create a connection?
Yeah, I think that it's about creating those relationships and making the first steps and really questioning yourself, whether this is aligned to your direction, and if you truly believe in those connections, then we could move forward into an authentic relationship. I think if it's something that's kind of just like coming at you and it's fashion and it's what looks right now, maybe you should question a little bit about what's happening within the industry. So yeah, I think that this directory, which there's so many platforms that Tegan and I are trying to create, that's one of them. We're really about creating the support for the ecology and the growth of the ecology of our industry. I feel like for far too long, First People of Australia have been a great source of inspiration rather than a part of the narrative of the Australian fashion industry. Where our organisation here is to grow the skills of First People within the Australian fashion industry. So we had this really beautiful program called the Shadowing Program, where we connected industry with First People that were interested in upskilling. So our whole show was a part of this shadowing program, as well as it was run and led by us. So we felt like it was a really great way for the movement of reconciliation and to continue that growth within the industry.
Yeah, fantastic. And Leila, I know you're also very supportive at the AFC. You've actually created a fund where 5% of all membership fees go to this First Nations fund. Tell me about some of the things that AFC is looking at supporting.
So we've obviously the AFC is a great fan of Indigenous fashion, and I'm a great fan of Lillian-Lee, who's actually amazing. And what you did this morning was phenomenal.
Thank you.
And I think woke all of us up a little bit more to the long road that we have ahead of us to really foster and support Indigenous fashion. And when I started with the AFC, I started to talk to many Indigenous leaders and stakeholders, including Grace, and to see how we could support. And the resonating sort of comments were, this is about an exchange. It's not tell me how to do things, because we can learn a lot from Indigenous designers and Indigenous creatives. So it's about an exchange. How can we work together? And also for there's we are very, I think the Australian fashion industry, as much as it's had its highs, ups and downs, but there's a lot of, I will say, prosperity that we can share to support the Indigenous fashion industry. And that's what we will want to do with the AFC. It's how can we work, how can we connect, how can we hopefully also contribute financially, we can, as much as we can, to set up Indigenous creatives and fashion leaders, to actually give them that little boost that, women need that boost. And that's just life. Any, I guess I will say disadvantaged areas of society or groups in society do need that extra boost. Yeah. And so that's what we need to do.
Completely. I think that, sorry. Sorry.
Can I hold your hand?
Yeah. I think that our country has, there's a lot of unseen and unspoken things that haven't been heard, and people don't have access to understanding what's happening in our backyards. And I think that a lot of that has to do with purpose. And I think if we can create, sorry, I need more sleep, but it is emotional. But, we just need more support. And I think that there's so many, sorry, I just need more sleep. No, but it is true.
It's okay.
I just think that there's so many women and men out there that just, they need the belief, and the support for them. People are just going to think that I cry all the time. I've had 2 interviews this morning, and the reporters were crying. But yeah, I feel like fashion can be that vessel to support this change in our country that we need. And that's all I got to say.
We applaud your vulnerability. We need to have these honest conversations, and we need to know the emotion that sits behind them. So thank you for sharing.
And if I may, we also need to talk about structural man-made inequality. I think when we talk about fashion and things not being recognised or told or seen, and the fact that, Australian history, you can ask a bunch of people in this room, they'll all give you a different version. It's problematic. We don't understand really where we've been and where we come from, and the huge gaps that exist they're man-made gaps. Yeah. That structural disadvantage, it's what I'm talking about, it's what Grace is talking about. And so that responsibility to re-bridge that and to provide real opportunity to, people that have been systemically held back is powerful and important.
Absolutely. I mean, it's something, Leila, you talk about as well. We often talk about how do we build back this fashion industry that is more human-centric. And, that is one of the really key foundations. I want to touch on one more topic, which is often a very controversial one, which is, Leila, you spoke about it, is it 23 kilos per capita going to landfill? There's just this excess consumption, and we know that the fashion industry is the second biggest polluter on the planet after the oil industry. It's just not sustainable. We're starting to see a bit of a shift happening. There is a decline of fast fashion. You've got businesses like Zara, Inditex is closing 1,200 doors. H&M is doing the same, closing a lot of doors. They are in decline. And on the flip side, we're seeing resale and rental really quickly on the rise. So the whole concept of ownership, particularly with young people, is really shifting, and they don't need to own as many items of clothing. I guess my question is the decline of fast fashion inevitable? Is that something that needs to happen? Do we need to move to a fewer, better, longer philosophy where we're buying higher quality goods that last longer, that have greater longevity, and that have more humane, attributes built into them, because we're really thinking about the whole value chain? And I'll start with you, Leila.
Yeah, I think you've nailed it already, Rosanna. You've summarized it really well. It's very hard to talk about this when you're someone who is supposed to and does support the growth and the prosperity of your industry. That's my job. But I also will say that I don't think we can, and I don't think anyone thinks we can go on the way that we have been, doing things, the way we consume more, sell, discount, take, change your clothes, change the way you do things. It is not sustainable. Sorry to use that word, but it isn't. And we know that from an environmental perspective, but from a social perspective. And really, we need to go back to the social perspective a lot. We're talking about it a lot today, from a modern slavery perspective, from a diversity perspective. And it is time. That's it. It's time. It doesn't mean that we have to lose, that companies don't make money or don't profit. That is, we need money in order to live and survive and buy things and eat and all of that sort of stuff, right? But do we just change the way that we do business? Changing business models, changing leadership's purpose, intention, right? When your number one priority is how much is my bottom line, regardless of what you say in your appendix and your footnote, and when your KPI, and we've talked about this a lot, right? When your number one incentive is how much money you make, it is going to be impossible for us to change this dynamic. We know it's not working, mental health issues all over the world, inequality all over the world. There's something not quite right. So it's not working capitalism. Maybe we need to do something else. That's what I think.
What about the rest of the panel, Lou? Do you have a view about this consumption contraction?
Yeah, look, I think, as a brand, it's really, and what we do, it's really about making good choices. And so, I understand the same. We have the same conversation in our business around how do we grow our business, how to reduce, consumption. It's one of those really hard things to kind of really try and understand or pinpoint. But I think if we can sit here as a brand and go, someone is going to buy a basic product over somebody else and we're making really good choices along the way, well, then I think that's a really good place to sit. And that's what we'll continue to kind of work towards.
Yeah, absolutely. Grace?
I strongly echo both of your points. What I'd add to it being from the human rights space is that, as Ursula de Castro, one of the founders of Fashion Revolution, famously said, the most sustainable wardrobe you could ever own is the one you already have. It is. We can't really buy our way into sustainability. It's an oxymoron. So how we look after what we have and value it and mend it is really important. And then, of course, people want to buy new things and have fun and enjoyment. So with that, if we value what we have and we place more value on that and we waste far less, then with what we invest in, let's invest in something good and beautiful that does no harm to people or planet. Or, one step further, does good and puts money back into the hands of people who have previously not had it, or brands like Outland Denim who create economic opportunities for survivors of modern slavery through creating a product that is beautiful. So for me, I look after what you have and then invest in what you value.
Yes, great. And Grace, your thoughts?
Sorry,
just
I got down to the line.
No, just that contraction of consumption. Is that a good thing? And what should we be shifting to purchasing instead?
Well, I'm an advocate for First Nations self-determined businesses, so I think it would be incredible to see more allies and Australians and globally to be supporting our First people in the fashion industry. I like to talk about how the act of creating a fibre started between a palm and a thigh and this rolling action. And so just trying to bring back some real acknowledgement to our First people of Australia and how important and pivotal they've been to the creation of all the fabric that we're wearing today. So I'd like to see an evolution and contribution from the globe and nationally towards investing in the growth of our First Australians in fashion.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. I have one last question for each panellist, and I want you to really tell me about your future vision. Close your eyes, fast forward, not too far into the future, 3 years from now. One amazing, significant change that you would love to see come to life in 3 years' time that has really enabled fashion to become a greater force for good. And I'll start with you, Grace.
Okay, thank you, because otherwise, sorry, need more sleep. For me, I would love to see an ecology of First Nations people embedded and as a more part of the Australian fashion narrative, and I think that it'll be so beautiful one day to go to a headline fashion runway that's a household name, that's a Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander designer. It'd be beautiful. It's beautiful.
And Grace, for you?
I would like to see the inclusion and centralising of the people who make our clothes in the value of the final product. If you don't know who makes your clothes, I hope that that's cancelled. I hope that in the next few years it's completely unacceptable for a brand to not have that information publicly available. And it doesn't even have to be ethical or conscious or sustainable, one of these big words. I'm just asking you to do no harm. It's pretty basic stuff in 2021. So I'd like for that to be the norm, and I'd like for the value of the final product to include the value of the person behind it and the people behind it.
Fabulous. Mary Lou?
I guess for me, what I would love to see is us building a more localised manufacturing hub. So that more Australian brands can actually produce onshore, and that we can sort of support our local industry, and that there's a place where people can actually go to actually get their designs into garment form, and we can obviously have full transparency across the supply chain.
Yeah, beautiful. Circularity becomes so much easier when it's controlled in one place. Yeah. And Leila?
I think for me, it would be great to see the world say, look at Australia. Look at how they are a force for change in the fashion industry, and look what they've done. They've managed to become more prosperous, but they're actually taking care of their people and the planet while doing that.
Yeah, beautiful. Well, I hope everybody is inspired as I am by this incredible panel, and that you're managing to take away at least one or two beautiful little golden nuggets that you can go away and really start to implement in your business starting from tomorrow. You really are very inspiring. Thank you so much for being the pioneers that are pushing the agenda in each of your different areas of expertise. So please join me in thanking the panel.
If I may, Rosanna.
And one little...
Rosanna,
yes.
if I may.
Yes.
Thank you. You've been an amazing facilitator, so please let me thank you. You've been wonderful. And Grace, you being here today after that, I can't believe it, thank you. And Grace, you came all the way from WA to do this with us. We're so appreciative and love the work you're doing. And you, lady, an exemplar of a brand of what we can do in Australia. So thank you so much, everyone. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. And one last housekeeping piece. Everybody who's attended today will receive an email from the AFC asking you to give feedback on this panel. So if you can please fill out that quick survey, it would be much appreciated. And again, thank you.
Thank you.